So Dr. Kritika has done her MD in palliative medicine from Tata Memorial Hospital and presently working in Kasturba Medical College, Manipur, as assistant professor. And she is the lead in pediatric palliative care in KMC. So welcome, Kritika, and it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sunil, sir. Good afternoon to everyone. And I'm really glad to be part of this training sessions. And really thank you for inviting me over for this. Um, as Ms. Raji has explained us about the agenda, I will just share my screen and we could start with today's presentation. Is my screen visible?
Yes, doctor.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Today's topic, as discussed by Dr. Sunil sir, that we will be talking about emergencies that we see in palliative care. Mainly, we'll be walking through about the acute medical management that is first required when we see emergencies like this, and the type of emergencies that we will see in our patients in the population would be classified broadly into these subheadings. Like in neurological, we could have spinal cord compression, raised intracranial pressure, status epilepticus. Then in gastrointestinal, we see commonly with abdominal malignancies presenting as malignant bowel obstruction. Then vascular, you would have superior vena cava obstruction or an acute pulmonary embolism or a patient with a deep vein thrombus presenting to the OPD. So with presenting symptoms presenting to this. In renal, you would have acute kidney injury following an obstructive uropathy, so renal failure would be one of the presentations. Very commonly, we do see in patients with inadequate pain control or the analgesia has not been taken properly, analgesic medicines are not regularly taken, there is poor compliance sometimes, and they would present to the OPD with a pain crisis. Or in certain percent of the patients, they would lead to opioid toxicity and present with an opioid overdose. In metabolic, many commonly we see is hypercalcemia of malignancy. Along with that, a lot of our patients who are off treatment only on supportive care due to the debility, poor oral intake, present with hyponatremia. Then in respiratory, we have airway obstruction, quite commonly seen with head and neck cancers who present with stridor into the triage. Then hematological, we have a hemorrhage. Now, hemorrhage would be seen in somebody with a malignant wound, which is infiltrating one of the arteries underlying to the wound, or you would have gastrointestinal bleed in a patient with a GI cancer like stomach cancers, or you would have bowel like colonic growth infiltrating. In such patients, there would be an internal hemorrhage. Certain patients present with pathological fractures. So under bone, you would have somebody presenting with severe pain following a fall or just a mild activity, and then on examination, we found out it is fractures. Or patients with severe sepsis leading to OPD with multiple other issues. So many of the times we will be having a presentation which is very similar, or certain things would be like on investigation, and then only we'll be able to find out. May not present directly with the obvious cause that we would find in that presentation. So to go through this, I would be taking through certain aspects through our emergencies that present to us. The most commonly seen is the malignant spinal cord compression. Now, when we look at malignant spinal cord compression, majority of the patients will have, if there is a thoracolumbar involvement, more so 70% of patients with thoracic vertebral mets, then with lumbar vertebral involvement, and very commonly seen with the cervical involvement presenting with a malignant spinal cord compression. Now, in this, there are certain cancers which have a more higher predisposition where metastasis to the vertebral bones would lead to any skeletal related events, and the patient would present with a MSCC. So, amongst the cancers that would have a predisposition would be the breast, lung, and prostate. More commonly seen that they all of them have a presentation at with the malignant breast cancer with bone metastasis already presenting in. So these are the kind of cancer groups that we should have in mind whenever a patient comes with a complaint of a back pain and all of that. So when we go to symptoms and understand, the most common presenting symptom preceding a skeletal related event is pain. Approximately most of the patients, that is 95% to patients will present with symptom of pain going over back 4 to 6 weeks. So the initial complaint would be a dull aching pain in the lower back, and it will be progressive. There'll be a discomfort that develops with it. And over a period, of course, it will be a severe unremitting pain when, patients would present you to the clinic with either with an impending cord compression or with a cord compression already set in. So this kind of a pain is usually nocturnal, more aggravated on movement or any kind of coughing, sneezing, any activity of the upper body. And you would find that before neurological signs would appear, the pain is the first presentation in these patients. And they would come, when you go for physical examination, you will find a lot of localized spinal tenderness, a radicular kind of pain associated with neuropathic pain signs. Then you would find in neurological signs setting in, like motor weakness would be the first common. So they would either come up with paraparesis, or they could be a quadriplegia in patients with a higher cervical involvement. So difficulty of walking, sudden knee buckling, weakness of the limbs. One fine day morning, they will notice they're not able to pass urine, or they're not passed stools for like 4 or 5 days, or certain patients have incontinence of bowel and bladder. And a certain sensory phenomenon, like especially in a patients with a thoracolumbar vertebral involvement, will give you like a tight band like sensation being tied across their chest or their abdominal level, where they will perceive it as a very tight band like sensation. So these kind of cues from the patient help us point towards more that there could be a spinal cord compression involved in this patient. Further, when we see of signs, as we know, it could be either a spastic paraparesis or a quadriparesis. There would be exaggerated reflexes in the start. There would be extensor planta. Sensory level will help us understand the level of the vertebral involvement, and that helps us also differentiate whether there is any the level of the involvement below, above the T12 or below the T12, will help us understand regarding with bowel and bladder involvement also in these patients. Certain autonomic changes also occur where there will be postural hypertension or blood pressure changes seen in these patients. So when we are evaluating further, we need to look at it as that what is the gold standard, and we have in different settings. Sometimes in a very small resource limited community setting, the first thing would be that we don't have an access to an MRI or a CT scan machine. At least an X-ray would help us understand whether there's any fracture of the vertebrae, or there's any reduction in the height of the intervertebral disc space. If not, you have a modalities like MRI available. It is actually the gold standard used for detecting an epidural metastatic disease or a frank spinal cord compression, because it has a very high sensitivity and specificity. Then you have the plain spine radiographs, but sometimes patients with a lumbar involvement, lumbar vertebral involvement, it is not very clear because of the gaseous distension of the bowels. So then it is difficult to really identify the vertebrae and comment on whether there is a spinal cord compression or there's a vertebral fracture. So based on this, after you examine and you have got a understanding of this, is what is a major modality and how do we look at management for this patient, how do we look at how our medications are going to work for this patient. So the pathophysiological process that involves is that an epidural tumor will cause a compression of the venous facets. This will in turn lead to secretion of the inflammatory cytokines, that is interleukin, prostaglandin, which causes the vasogenic edema. This vasogenic edema in the local region will cause nerve impingement, which would either cause neurological deficits, or there would be ischemia, which would have further amino acids the regulation occurring, then cytotoxic edema, and where there is a calcium channels which open up, which causes the permanent neural damage. So if at all we understand this pathway, so then the points that we see marked here in yellow, these are the parts which help us in managing the treatment, addressing to these particular regions of the process that is there. So when we look at the management for this patient, the first and foremost is usually the pain relief that we need to look at, because it is a very severe, unremitting kind of a pain, aggravated even with mild movement from the bed. The patient is not able to get up, is lying down flat, or sometimes will be writhing in pain. So based on the pain severity, using a WHO analgesic ladder, understanding the type of pain, whether it is a nociceptive pain, then you could consider adding non-opioids as well as opioids if it is a very severe pain presentation. Along with that, if there is signs of neuropathic pain, you could use adjuvants. Now, since here we know there is a bony pain involvement, so use of agents like bisphosphonates could be helpful for this patient. Anti-edema measures that will come through. So these are the first that you should look at. Looking at constipation also, because depending upon the level of involvement in the spine, whether it is above T12 or below T12, if it is above, most commonly the patient will have a spastic bowel, will not be able to pass stools freely. So then a bowel regimen is involved where you're giving more of a stimulant laxatives for this patient. Whereas if there is incontinence of bowel, then you need to look at developing a bowel regimen for a patient who is paraplegic, and with the help of a stool softener, a stimulant, an osmotic laxative being given. And this has to be done as a routine, taught to the patient to perform a routine so that the patient passes stools at a particular time period of the day and will prevent soiling of clothes and the bed while the patient is in not able to move around much. The further part is the most important is to initiate on steroids. As we saw in the pathophysiological process, that it inhibits, dexamethasone will inhibit the prostaglandin E2 and vascular endothelial growth factors, which are involved in the vasogenic edema. So as in the edema decreases, the compression over the nerve decreases, and there is lesser chances of further neural damage to happen. And that in itself will bring down the pain also for this patient. It is highly recommended that at the first presentation, we start the dose up to a maximum of 40 milligram per day is mentioned. Immediately in our population, what we have used is around the dosage of 16 to 24 milligrams as a start initial dose, and then divide it up into 3 doses throughout the day. After starting steroids, we need to first and foremost see whether this patient has a single level of obstruction or has a multiple levels of bone mets or multiple level of bone involvement, which we need to evaluate whether this patient should be sent for a surgery for spine stabilization or should the patient be sent to radiation. Now, if we consider surgery, till the time the surgery, it's an emergency procedure. So till the time the steroids are continued. But if we look at a patient getting radiation therapy for the bone metastasis and a spinal cord compression, the steroid should be continued at the same dose, because even radiation will lead to a lot of vasogenic edema because of the severe heat that is there. So the steroids are continued at the same dose till RT completion. And after the completion of radiation, then you start tapering it off slowly over every 3 to 5 days to a smaller dose and then stop it. So that's how the dexamethasone is initiated and then tapered off. The radiation also, as it's said that the presentation should, if the presentation is very acute, that say within 24 hours the patient has presented to the clinic with signs of spinal cord compression, the earlier the radiotherapy being given, the higher chances of the neurological recovery to happen. And otherwise, it could be even there could be some neurological damage residual. Patient may have persistent quadriparesis or paraparesis depending on the presentation. So radiation is usually directed at the vertebral metastatic sites that is causing either an epidural involvement or a thecal sac indentation. And most of the patients will achieve pain relief. Up to 60 to 90% of pain relief would be there with radiation therapy and steroids over after 1 week of therapy has been completed. So it may not be an immediate relief. Some patients who may have presented to you with the symptom, you start an analgesic, then you would notice that the radiation has started and the patient is complaining of severe pain after radiation has been started in. That is because of the vasogenic edema that is also developing because of radiation therapy. So dexamethasone has to be continued for that particular period of time, and reassurance to the patient. We explain that pain may increase after RT has been started, but it will eventually decrease and slowly be well controlled with your analgesics after radiation has radiation therapy has been completed. And most of the times, the patients who were ambulatory, like when you see a performance status score, we use the ECOG scale or the Australian Karnowski performance scale of 80 or ECOG scale of 1 or 2. Patients who are ambulatory like this prior this particular event, higher chances of them to be able to maintain their ambulation post this event too. So the earlier the RT being given, the better the chances of recovery. In that, there are different regimens that are being planned, which is a 30 gray in 10 fractions. You will have 20 gray in 5 fractions or a 8 gray in single fraction. There are studies being done that either of these three does not have a difference in the treatment outcomes. They decide how much the dose should be based on the prognosis of the patient. If a patient has a very an oncologically a better cancer which has improved survival with treatment, or the patient was in a early stages of cancer with presentation like with this metastasis, or ECOG of 1 and 2 has a better prognosis, say up to 6 months to 1 year, they would prefer giving a 30 gray in 10 fractions. Whereas somebody who does not have a very good prognosis, but because of the severe pain, and to try and see whether you can probably reverse that, they would just give a 8 gray in single fractions. That is a practice that will be done, which is evidence based. There's a Lancet paper, there's a systematic review that has been done that all three regimens do not have any difference in the terms of treatment outcomes. So after radiotherapy, what I talked about is the surgery. So it is mainly seen when it is in a radio-resistant tumor, or when there is a vertebral column instability developed, that there's a complete fracture of the vertebrae and it is leading to severe pain, then we could refer them to just spinal stabilization. And it is mainly seen as done commonly in patients with a better prognosis, also where a single level of vertebrae is involved. When there's a multiple levels, then you can anticipate that this time the patient has got a particular level. If there's a high chance, patient would again present with a similar kind of a cord compression at other vertebral levels. So when we move on to this further, the prognosis for this, as we talked about, is pre-treatment ambulatory status and the time from development of motor deficits to the radiotherapy are the most important predictors whether the patient would be able to be ambulatory post the treatment. And a patient with a single metastasis, a radiosensitive tumor, like breast, prostate, or myeloma, will have a longer survival. Whereas with patients with multiple metastases, there's visceral or brain mets, and patients with GI or lung cancers may have a shorter survival. So based on this understanding, it helps us to prognosticate in such a patient, also be able to explain to the patient and the family regarding the outcomes of this treatment, so that we are preemptively able to discuss the outcomes of the procedure that we're going to give, the treatment that we are going to plan for this family. Moving on, the emergency why it is there, because the delay in diagnosis sometimes result in loss of mobility, the bladder dysfunction, and decreased survival, because it's seen that the studies show a patient developing metastatic spinal cord compression, the survival rate is seen at maximum 3 to 6 months. It reduces significantly, and it has an effect on the quality of life, and that would be really detrimental for a patient suddenly who was ambulatory would now be bedbound and will not be fit enough for any other further disease directed treatment. So the urgent need here is an emergency MRI and immediate initiation of specific therapy, like starting them on steroids, looking whether we could go for a surgery or a radiotherapy, helps in trying to improve the outcome post treatment and may help in preserving the functionality of this patient. That is why it is important to identify earlier, especially patients who present with back pain, low backache, in the known cancers that we find, like breast, lung, and prostate cancer, where it is highly likely that the patient would have bone metastasis. So it is important to address that symptom and evaluate if it is a persisting symptom that presents with. If you're not able to find out any particular cause as to why it is happening, go for evaluation. Like there are bone scans that we can go, ask the patient to undergo an MRI spine to rule out whether there is any such kind of a problem, which could be picked up early, and radiation could be started early before presenting of a cord compression. When we move on to the next, is one of the common we see is raised intracranial pressure. So most common cause would be a primary brain tumor or brain metastasis, or in patients with neoplastic meningitis. Symptom presenting would be the patient would be having irrelevant talk, agitated, altered sensorium, headache associated with vomiting, blurring of vision. There could be seizures, or sometimes in patients due to drop metastasis, there would be a focal neurological deficit seen. It would be a very acute in onset, would have it will be progressed very fast over a period of 2 or 3 days, and would the patient's sensorium would also be fluctuating during the entire course. So as we know, the presentations in particular cancer is higher. So it is seen that lung, breast, and melanoma is higher chances of developing brain metastasis, wherein the symptoms also will be exaggerated in presentation of the particular brain part involved. So cerebral hemisphere, you'll find 80% of the times involved. Cerebellum would be 15%, and brain stem in 5%. Below is a table that you will get an understanding the kind of common symptom presentations with a patient with brain metastasis compared to a patient with meningitis or intracranial involvement. So understanding these should be like, first, either is to rule out a metabolic cause. Second is to rule out whether there's any brain metastasis in this patient or any meningitis in the patient. It could be neoplastic. Sometimes it could also be due to sepsis. So the first thing to be kept in mind is to evaluate and to start with urgent anti-edema measures. So the medical decompressive therapy involves starting the patient on steroids, the mannitol, it should be given IV, or oral glycerol in patients, and furosemide in cases which are refractory. Dexamethasone is the most preferred steroid that we have easily available here also. So we start at a dosage of 16 to 25 milligram and start dividing it into three equal divided doses. Make sure that whenever we start steroids in these patients, it is to be given only during the daytime. So we keep a schedule saying that 8 a.m. should be the first dose, 12 p.m. should be the second dose, and after 4 p.m. no further dose should be given. So even if it should never be written as an 8-hourly schedule. So if you give the steroids to a patient in the night, highly likely they will be agitated, they will be insomniac, they would have an altered sensorium, and we would call it as delirium, and then you would start management for delirium, not knowing that the patient had received steroids prior. And also the rule of thumb in this is to continue steroids till, because if it is related to a brain metastasis, continue the steroids till the whole brain radiation therapy has been started and completed, and then taper over slowly by 2 to 4 milligram per day and stop after giving it as a 1 milligram per week. We have to look at it that if a patient is diabetic, to monitor blood sugars and help them with giving sugar charting and an insulin sliding scale in case of hyperglycemia that develops in. We start on mannitol, which is 20% 100 ml given IVQ 8 hourly for 3 days only. During this time, we need to monitor for blood pressure and hydration. Also look at the sodium levels. If the patient has severe hyponatremia, moderate to severe hyponatremia, we should avoid giving mannitol, first correct hyponatremia and then start it. We could also, if a patient has been on a mannitol for 3 days and you persistently find that there is symptoms of raised ICP continuing, you could switch over to giving oral glycerol if the patient is tolerating orally or via a nasogastric tube. There are patients who are put on furosemide or acetazolamide for this patient, who are refractory to mannitol, refractory to glycerol being given. Then you could consider furosemide or acetazolamide. Patient would present with headache with the severe intracranial pressure. So the drug of choice would be a paracetamol plus minus or an NSAID. Very rarely we would go up to a step 2 and 3 in case, because it's being told that tramadol as well as tapentadol will reduce the seizure threshold. So these patients with raised ICP, brain metastasis, are more likely to have a seizures, and it would increase the intracranial pressure also. Even the same with higher doses of morphine. Unless and until where we are seeing a patient is clearly end of life, despite your management, the patient is not improving and now it's moving towards end of life, then you could consider adding an opioid to relieve the distress as part of palliative sedation, and adjuvants as and when indicated. So the other part of raised intracranial pressure would be seizure control and giving WBRT. So whole brain RT is preferably given in patients with a better prognosis, a survival of 6 months of time, where they would have some improvement. The earlier doses were 30 gray in 10 fractions. Now we have even even 20 gray in 5 fractions is given for certain patients. External beam radiotherapy is considered. Along with that, you have SBRT, which is a more focused. You can even give it to a particular lesion if it's a single lesion involvement itself. So there are various techniques that have come up in that we should always consider discussing with the oncology team to see what can we do so that we can try and correct at least whatever is correctable. If not, then you could just go towards only symptom control and supportive care. The other part that comes into is we see is status epilepticus, which is defined as more than 5 minutes of continuous or more than 2 episodes of seizures with incomplete recovery of consciousness. So there would be a varied etiology for it. It could be a primary seizure disorder, leptomeningeal metastasis, brain metastasis, metabolic infection, hemorrhage, paraneoplastic, hypoxia, or a pre-existing seizure disorder since a young age. The main treatment involved, as we know, for such a patient, we are very adept. We're understanding a patient who presents in a status epilepticus. We've learned in medicine also how do we go about. So these are the basic that we would follow through. The next, which I talked about, is that we see commonly hypercalcemia. The commonest presentation, what we have noticed is here the evidence says that it is in lung, breast, and myeloma or lymphoma. Lately, we have been also seeing patients more and more with head and neck cancers, especially the CF buccal mucosa patients presenting with a hypercalcemia. So they may not have a very clear-cut presentation of with signs of hypercalcemia, but on a further investigation, when they turn up, we have found out that there are a lot of patients presenting with moderate to severe hypercalcemia in a head and neck cancer patient, advanced head and neck cancer patients. So lately, like I know myself because one of my colleagues in Tata Memorial Hospital also did as a student project to see the prevalence of this, and there was a high number that we saw coming to the OPD who presented with this particular emergency. So the main thing is that the patient would be here, would have neurological signs there. They would be very irritable. Either they would be very lethargic or irritable, stuporous, coma. They would have nausea, vomiting as a presenting symptom, constipation in some patients. Renal, there would be polyuria, dehydration. They would also have increased thirst also along with it. Cardiovascular, you would find changes as shortening of the QT interval, widening of the T wave, and prolonged PR and with arrhythmias. Evaluation, we'll find out, we will be able to guess the corrected because the ionic calcium is not the real calcium level that is there. So we need to always look at the corrected calcium levels. The corrected calcium level is calculated based on the measured ionic calcium levels in the serum analysis. You add, you have to, this is the formula on the right that you see here, that the serum albumin levels are considered, and this formula helps you to give up the corrected calcium levels that is presently there. Based on this level, it is divided into mild, moderate, and severe. The first line of management for this any patient is to maintain hydration. Now, when we start hydration at the level of around 100 to 125 ml of sodium chloride to be given per hour, we also need to look at fluid overload. So make sure we patients are given diuretics or started on diuretics like furosemide can be given. Patients with moderate to severe hypercalcemia, we should consider starting a patient on salmon calcitonin. So dosage is typically started at 200 international units every Q8 hourly to up to 400 international units. And it is only to be given in the first 3 days of initiating treatment. Beyond 3 days, it has a tendency to cause tachyphylaxis. So we don't continue beyond the third day. In patients also who have a normal renal function, you could consider starting on bisphosphonates on the first day in severe hypercalcemia. So commonly that we use is zoledronic acid. Based on the creat clearance now here, different patients will have, this because patients with hypercalcemia, because of dehydration, would have an acute kidney injury and they would present with a creatinine levels above 1. Then we should consider zoledronate at a dose reduction based on the creat clearance levels. So there are formulas available. There's a table available also. Steroids should be initiated in them. But recent studies have talked about that steroids do not add much of a value in reduction of hypercalcemia, but it has the exact pathophysiological levels has not been known, but it still continues to be part of the NCCN guidelines to be continued as a management for hypercalcemia. And we need to check calcium levels every 12 hours to 24 hours in the initial 2 days, and then after normalization, it could be tapered off, and then the patient has a better relief from this. So it is important in advanced cancer patients, even if it's a limited life expectancy, because it has an impact on survival. Also, it impacts on the quality of life, and it has a role in reducing the symptom burden for this patient. So it has to be addressed as an emergency and always kept in mind whenever we look at a patient with altered sensorium, nausea, vomiting, and a predisposition to certain cancers, that there could be a metabolic cause involved with it. As I talked about hypocalcemia, similarly, we have a lot of patients with hyponatremia. Hyponatremia involvement is, when we look at the management part of it, we need to see the volume status of the patient also. That will help us easily identify and try to treat the cause of it rather than just correcting sodium level, because different causes have a different kind of a treatment also. We have a common presentation of patients with the type 2 hypovolemic patients where they would be having vomiting, dehydration. Somebody would be on chemotherapy. They would present with severe dehydration symptoms after the chemotherapy induced toxicity, or patients presenting with SIADH. So the management, if you see the type 1 hypervolemic, where there is hypoalbuminemia, CCF or cirrhosis, it is mainly due to fluid overload state. In a hypovolemic, it will be hypotension, tachycardia, collapsed veins, and underhydration. In a euvolemic status is when SIADH presents with it. There will be a normal hydration status. The risk factors here is malignancy, infection, or as a paraneoplastic. Symptoms would be very similar to like metabolic encephalopathy symptoms, like headache, irritability. There will be stuporous, weakness would be there. There will be muscle cramps in some patients, even leading to seizures and coma. So when we look at correction of sodium, it should be never more than 6 to 8 milliequivalents in the 24 hours period, because there's a risk of CPM in this patient, that pontine myeloma that can cause in this patient. So the understanding would be that whenever we are trying to correct based on the type of the cause of this patient, it could be either it's a hypovolemic status, then with adequate hydration, there should be a correction in the patient. So whenever we are looking at whether we should correct based on 3% saline or not, a general formula that can be applied is by looking at calculating the sodium deficit, calculating the volume of 3% saline. Using this formula, use the time needed for correction and the rate of infusion that should be used in. Now, specifically in our population who present with SIADH, the mainstay of treatment for them is water restriction. If there is very severe hyponatremia, you could consider starting the patient on 3% NS, correcting the cause if it is feasible. If it is, despite your management, it is not improving, then you could go on to using tolvaptan, one of the Vaptans that are being commonly prescribed for patients with malignancy associated SIADH, that is paraneoplastic syndrome, where Vaptans can help it. Even when we initiate tolvaptan, it is started at a 7.5 milligram dose. Over 1 or 2 days, you can taper it up to 15 milligram per day, and it should not be continued more than 1 month period of time. Discontinued after we achieve a level of normal sodium levels, and then ask the patient to have a restricted fluid intake and monitor sodium levels if required on a future basis. The next one of the emergencies is about subacute airway obstruction. As we know, it is in a subacute presentation, it will be more, the causes would be like an intrinsic or extrinsic. Patient would have shortness of breath, there will be an inspiratory stridor. In acute, it would be like a severe progressing sudden dyspnea. There would be hemodynamic collapse, and it is a very severely distressing event that the patient and the family are going through. The mainstay of management in this would be, in case of a subacute presentation, trying to evaluate the underlying cause, if hypoxic with supplemental oxygen, high dose of steroids, if it would be because of an extrinsic compression. Opioid and benzodiazepines help in reducing the refractory dyspnea for this patient. And certain times, if it is because of an extrinsic or an intrinsic mass which is causing tracheal obstruction, then you could consider checking with the radiation oncologist whether, if it's a radiosensitive tumor, then RT could also help in reducing the compression and relieving the dyspnea for this patient. What if it's an acute presentation? Patient is clearly deteriorated over a period of time. You've had a goals of care discussion, you've educated the family, and they understand that it is mainly a very acute event which is life-threatening at this present. And most of the patients with advanced malignancies or advanced organ illness may not want to go for aggressive therapy. So in such case, it should be more, focus should be on rapid relief of distress. So by either palliative sedation, using non-opioids. If at all there is severe dyspnea, then you could consider adding a opioid infusion along with it, and providing family with a constant support, and making them understand what exactly the situation is around. In one of this would be the SVC obstruction. So the commonly is the malignant obstruction. Either it could be because of an intrinsic cause like a tumor thrombus or a vascular thrombus, or it could be an extrinsic cause because of lymph node compression. Most of the times, patient with right upper lobe cancer, upper lobe of the lung cancer would have a presentation of a SVC obstruction, local infiltration, or fibrosis secondary to radiation therapy. As I said, it will be seen mainly in the bronchogenic carcinoma, lymphomas, and thymomas. So that there are, based on the level of obstruction, it is classified into three different types. So it is taken at the level above the azygos, above at the level of the azygos vein, and obstruction below the level of azygos vein. So when the obstruction is above the level of azygos vein, you would find that the collateral veins, such as the more like the cervical veins, are more dilated. When compared to the level of at the azygos, you'll have more of the thoracic veins will be, so small superficial thoracic veins will be dilated. When it comes to a level below the level of azygos, the blood will backflow through the azygos vein into the inferior vena cava. So clinically, we will be able to identify the level of obstruction, and based on that, planning for a further management would be initiated. So the common presentation would be dyspnea. You'll have upper extremity and facial edema would be presenting. Now in the picture where we see is at normal presentation, the patient does not have a flushed face, that the normal sitting posture. The moment you lift up the arms, it is causing an obstruction towards the blood flow, and the patient is having a very flushed appearance. There could be a headache, a blurring of vision due to the cerebral and retinal edema. Shortness of breath would be present because of the tracheal edema. In this patient, the signs you would see is JVP would be elevated and non-pulsatile, swollen face eyelids, upper limbs, the suffused conjunctiva, a dusky cyanosis would be there, and you see a lot of chest collaterals with tachypnea for this patient. The mainstay again in this patient would be about starting on steroids, that is dexamethasone from 16 to 25 milligrams, furosemide in case of edema, bronchodilators because it will help in reducing the tracheal bronchoconstriction, and low molecular weight heparin if you consider that it's a vascular thrombus that has led to this superior vena cava obstruction, and if needed, an SVC stenting. Most of the times if the patient is having a tumor thrombus that you have evaluated based on a CT scan, because the gold standard in identifying whether the patient has an SVC obstruction is through a CT thorax to be done. If it's a tumor thrombus, very unlikely that it will respond to a low molecular weight heparin for this patient. There, the mainstay of treatment would again be only providing supportive care and symptom control. So patient education, counseling to the family and the patient about the prognosis of this patient after developing SVC, initiating opioids if required, benzodiazepine if there's a lot of anxiety due to the dyspnea, these all should be looked in. The further part is about hemorrhage. Now, there are various causes. Mainly, one of the causes most important is due to cancer invasion or destruction. That in head and neck, you have a risk of catastrophic bleeding. Many of the patients with head and neck cancers may have a cervical lymph nodal involvement, and they would turn up with carotid blowout syndrome. Then lung metastasis would lead to hemoptysis. GI tract cancers like gastric or rectal or stromal tumors, and in gynecological cancers. Patients with marrow infiltration and leading to thrombocytopenia, so leukemias, lymphomas will have a lot of presentation with thrombocytopenia, which could cause hemorrhage. Others are the treatment-related causes. In certain patients who have oral mucositis or even colitis would have some amount of blood in stools due to thrombocytopenia post chemotherapy, anticoagulation who are on warfarin who are not able to afford low molecular weight heparin, they'll be on warfarin. And if INR is not serially monitored, they could lead to having sudden bleeding, and patients with NSAIDs like aspirin. Other patients who have higher chances of hemorrhage are with advanced liver disease, DIC, or acquired coagulation defects. Mainstay of management here would be the first is the general measures, that is looking at the cause, trying to make sure the airway breathing circulation is maintained. If required, transfusion. Certain patients with coagulation disorders to start on FFP, vitamin K. If it is a rectal involvement, then you look at sucralfate enemas. If it's a GI tract, mainly the stomach ulcers, or you have stomach infiltrating carcinoma, there you can consider starting on a PPI or a sucralfate syrup. Certain patients, even hemostatic RT can also help. So hemostatic radiation can also help in controlling the local bleeders that would be therein, because not always would be a main artery involvement that could be leading to bleeding. Even the smaller microvascular structures that are there present in the tumor would also lead to a slow ooze. In such patients, hemostatic RT helps in causing fibrosis of the smaller vessels, and that in turns reduces the bleeding. Whereas in a patient where if you are with your regular general measures, it is not improving, you could do a CT angiogram to identify a particular bleeding source. If at all, if it is feasible to go for an angioembolization of that particular artery, then we should also consider if it is really detrimental or the patient has a better survival, where you look at trying to treat the problem first rather than just looking at end of life care for this patient. But in case if it's a terminal hemorrhage, that despite these measures or there's a severe arterial bleed, where all these general measures will not have any effect and the patient is going to have a catastrophic bleeding leading to death. In such a patient, the mainstay would be about making sure that the patient's distress and anxiety is reduced. Sometimes we do counsel patients with head and neck cancers, malignant wounds in the head and neck region, where we sense that there could be an impending carotid blowout or have a carotid blowout syndrome. We give them kind of a small package where they can have is we tell them to arrange for dark towels. We ask them to have these placed next to the patient's bed. Then we provide them with a midazolam nasal spray that you get. Now the nasal spray has a 5 milligram per puff concentration. So the simplest thing that we tell them is, in case if the patient has such a bleeding, is use a dark towel to compress at the site. Same time, if it is a large quantity bleeding coming in and patient is awake and getting very anxious, use the midazolam spray to sedate the patient. So while sedation, it helps in the the relieving the stress and the anxiety that the patient would have, and providing some comfort to the patient. If at all it is done in a hospital, if it happens in a hospital setting, similar measures are also used, because it is not, the sisters may not have enough of time to go in, load a midazolam into the syringe and then administer to the patient. So keeping a bedside midazolam nasal spray helps. So it can be given as 2 puffs each nostril till sedation is achieved, and then repeated if required. And major important thing is trying to be there as possible next to the family when such a catastrophic bleeding occurs. So the mainstay involved is achieving sedation, in if required suctioning if it is involving the upper airway, dark towels to prevent. By dark towels also, the sight of blood on plain white would be very distressing. So that's why dark green or brown color towels, which will mask the color of the blood and will not provide any source of distress to the family when they're seeing such catastrophic bleeding occurring, is very important to be kept in. So in a hospital, what we tell them is those dark green sheets that we get from the OT. So we have a patient, if suppose we understand this patient might have a carotid blowout, or would have patients with the upper lung, the lung carcinoma would have hemoptysis episode. We have the CSOT send us a few dark towels from which are used actually for the OT purpose, but we have them even kept for the at the bedside, so that in case there is a episode like this, we have it ready by the patient. The next would be about fractures, where mainly they would be due to the tumor, which will have a lytic or a blastic type of involvement, seen in breast, prostate, lung, thyroid, and renal carcinomas. There is a scoring that we use, that is a Mirel scoring, which can help us identify the kind of management that should the patient would go in. The points are based on the site, pain, lesion, and the size of the tumor involvement. And based on that, if the score is less than 7, there is no risk to go for any further surgery. 8 to 5, there is increased risk, and 9 to 33, there is a definitive need for this patient to undergo surgery. So the major thing is, the first important is prophylactic orthopedic procedures, consider for palliative radiotherapy, and use of adequate analgesia based on our WHS analgesic ladder, use of either non-opioids plus opioids and adjuvants. The next main important is our pain crisis. So it's an event in which the patient reports severe uncontrolled pain that is causing the patient, family, or both very severe distress. So a patient presenting to a OPD with severe pain that is on an NRS more than 7 on 10, it requires rapid opioid titration. So it has to be treated as a medical emergency. So managing pain crisis, the main prerequisite to use IV or subcutaneous morphine should be that the patient should have a pain score of about 7 on 10, likelihood of partial or complete response to morphine. The first and foremost thing that we would advise is uh, getting a venous access. If not, subcutaneous access should be taken in. Pre-medicate with metoclopramide if the patient is opioid naive, and also to prevent the sudden nausea that can develop with giving IV morphine. Now, if you look at a morphine vial that is available in India, each vial has 10 milligram per ml concentration. So now I want to titrate this dose for this patient by giving 1 milligram per minute and then go up on the dose till I achieve adequate analgesia. So for this, I will have to dilute it accordingly so that I get a dilution of 1 milligram per ml. I would give 1 ml, that is 1 milligram of morphine, wait for 5 to 10 minutes, repeat if required if the patient's score is not come down to less than 3. So such a way, if the sedation is achieved until a sedation score of greater than 2, then I would want to stop it and wait, that because I do not want to even end up into developing toxicity for this patient. So the main sequence would be on the right if you see for IV and subcutaneous, where you give 1 milligram up to 10 milligrams that can be given every 5 minutes, and pause for 5 minutes, check for the patient's pain control. Once you get at the minimum of, say, you have attempted 3 doses, so 3 milligram of morphine that is required for this patient in IV formulation, we convert it into equianalgesic dosage into the oral formulation if the patient prefers to be continued to be on morphine, or transdermal fentanyl formulation. So the protocol for managing pain crisis in a patient who is already receiving opioids. So now patient was already on, say, a particular dose. So whenever we want to convert it to an oral opioid to an IV dose, so IV dose equal to oral dose divided by 3, which is the rescue dose. So example, if a patient is on 10 milligram oral morphine per dose, which is divided by 3, will get around as a 3.5 milligram would be the rescue dose for this patient. So when we are trying to administer during a pain crisis, administer double the rescue dose by slow titration. So by giving at least 2 milligrams every 5 minutes, you will be able to administer and find out if there is any relief. If not, if there's no relief despite continuing the same measures for over 15 to 20 minutes, then re-administer the dose and increase up the dose by 50% if the pain still persists above 7 and 10. If you repeat after this and the pain is still presenting, look for other causes of pain that could be there. Sometimes there would be a mixed kind of a pain that the patient presents with, nociceptive as well as neuropathic pain. So also evaluate whether there is any opioid hyperalgesia that is developing in this patient who has been on opioids for a very long time. Then we may need to consider for opioid rotation. If at all patient has neuropathic pain like signs of allodynia, hyperalgesia, then we need to also look at managing with for neuropathic pain crisis where you consider lignocaine or ketamine infusions. So whenever acute pain crisis is coming, I know our first thought always comes into titrating with an opioid, but it is always important that after your initial management, if the pain is still persisting, to look for other causes of pain or other types of pain that the patient would present with. So the co-analgesics that we would see, as I talked about earlier, is where I mentioned about ketamine and lignocaine for a patient with refractory neuropathic pain. Other patients would have is because of a severe bone pain. There could be a fracture. There could be even vertebral mets where the patient is on a opioid, on other adjuvants for a period of time and is not having relief. You could consider a bolus dose of ketorolac, which is very safer to give and it is highly potent to aspirin. Though it is very nephrotoxic, so we have to make sure that we prevent in patients who really have a better prognosis or already CKD in the earlier stages 1 to 3. But if it's a CKD stage 5, then you can definitely consider giving NSAIDs because you're worried about further organ damage happening here. So then if it is mainly about pain, we can consider giving the patient on ketorolac. Patients with bone mets, neuropathic pain, spinal cord compression, dexamethasone as an adjuvant can also help. Certain patients sometimes we have seen is patients with liver metastasis. Now they come with severe right hypochondriac pain. You start giving opioids and the patient does not have relief. Will be having severe pain with deep inspiration, and that is leading to dyspnea, and further other issues are getting aggravated. This would be very likely seen in a patient with liver capsule stretch pain, where dexamethasone has a very good effect in reducing the inflammatory pain that is being generated due to the liver capsule stretch. So a start dose of even 8 milligram IV helps in reducing significantly the pain, being initiated due to the liver capsule stretch. Other way, when we're looking at completely refractory pain, or there would be other components to pain. When we look at total pain, there would be a lot of psychological distress. There would be a lot of spiritual distress in patients. Need to identify that also when we're trying to treat a patient with acute pain crisis. So when we look at it in general as a whole, we we take into all of these accounts when you're looking at pain crisis. Further important to this is also to remember about opioid toxicity when we have patients on regular opioid usage or when you're doing opioid titration. So the first and foremost signs of opioid toxicity that could develop even with the step 2 opioids are sedation, delirium, hallucination. Further points that you would see is pinpoint pupils, myoclonic jerks, there would be seizures or even cardiopulmonary arrest in these patients. So the main indications why we do a reversal. So what is one of the drugs that we use for reversal is naloxone. The indication for is mainly on systemic signs, that is respiratory rate less than 8 per minute, or if the respiratory rate is between 10 to 12 per minute and difficulty to arouse or clinically cyanose, or the respiratory rate is less than 12 but difficulty to arouse and SpO2 less than 90%. So the dilution that is made for this is we have a vial of 400 micrograms, that is 0.4 milligram per ml. It is diluted in 10 ml of saline to a concentration of around 40 mics per ml. So 40 microgram per ml is the concentration that we would get in. And that much is what we would want to administer every 2 minutes until respiratory status is at a satisfactory level. That is, respiratory rate increases to about 12 per minute. Patient is the sedation has improved, that the patient is at least arousable, is responding to commands, and see a significant difference in the saturation levels also in patients where there is hypoxia developing. So when we're doing even reversal, we also need to keep in mind about the sudden pain crisis also developing. So if it is a patient with acute opioid use toxicity, the reversal would also help, will give us an understanding whether the patient developing pain crisis also or not. So we need to be prepared hand in hand at the same time to look at that. Also, after giving naloxone, we need to wait for at least 1 hour to see, because the half-life of this is 60 minutes. To till 60 minutes, you will have the action of naloxone continuing. Beyond that, if the patient is still sedated, then you need to continue reversal with naloxone till you're able to achieve a significant difference in the further status and our respiratory status is satisfactory. So based on that, thank you so much. I know we had very limited time and I ate up a lot of our time of the lecture, but I know this was a very rushed thing. There were so many things in a when you look at managing palliative care emergencies, the list is still not ended. We had a lot of other topics that we couldn't cover up, but these are the ones that I thought that were we commonly see more important, and management wise how palliative care principles also looking at correcting the correctables will also help in managing other symptoms too. So I thank everybody here to be patiently waiting and listening to my talk. I thank you so much to Pallium India for organizing this talk. Thank you. I see some question about what exactly do we mean by dark towels. Dark towels, I mean any dark colored towels I meant. So it could be the like those dark brown, dark green colored, which could easily mask the color of the blood. Such kind of dark colored towels should be used in. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kritika. I think Dr. Sunil is not there. Ma'am, I think we have one more unanswered question. Dr. Vinayak has asked for water restriction for how much time?
Especially with patients with SIADH, many of them who present with paraneoplastic syndromes, the water restriction of around 1.5 to 2 liters is to be continued for a longer period. It is not time bound actually. So it would again present with hyponatremia if they go in with the symptoms developing. So that's why tolvaptan is given till 1 month of time till correction of hyponatremia comes in. But fluid restriction is the mainstay of treatment to prevent further hyponatremia.
Thank you, ma'am. So we have another 5 minutes to go. If anybody has any doubts, you can unmute yourself or give it in the chat.
Dr. Geeta Rana, I think, mentions about, Madam, you're talking about survival after spinal cord compression. It is based on multiple studies, evidence, literature suggests that, they have seen that the survival of patients due to multiple factors, not only because of the spinal cord compression, but due to debility, poor oral intake, activity, then not being fit for further disease modifying therapy. All of these factors add in and contribute towards the disease burden, the poor symptom control, poor quality of life, these all of things. So in literature, what they have seen based on Kaplan-Meier curves that they have plotted for such patients over a period of time has showed that 3 to 6 months is what they have seen, a survival after patient develops spinal cord compression. I see another question which says what to do for repeated ascites. Is that right, Dr. Archana, madam? Okay. Mainly ascites, if the once we look at is the SAG ratio. Now, many of the patients will be developing if they have a adjoining liver cirrhosis, then diuretics help in reducing the refilling time after doing a paracentesis. But if in case is because of an abdominal malignancy, omental and peritoneal nodules, that is the cause of ascites developing, then we either it is tapping at a particular period of time only when the patient has a severe distress that there is a tense ascites developing, or you can consider inserting a pigtail or a fluorex catheter. That is what I have experienced in Tata Memorial Hospital, that an indwelling pigtail was inserted for patients who were mainly for supportive care, only on palliative care follow up and not for any oncology management, and your main lookout would be to reduce the distress. So in such patients, we would tell them to have a pigtail catheter inserted. The interventional radiology team would help us in this. And the patient would be able to, at home, whenever they felt like there was a three-way attached to the pigtail catheter. So whenever they felt that there was a distress and there was severe distension of the abdomen, they would open up the three-way. The patient's family or the patient would be explained how to do that, drain around 1 liter of fluid at particular time and then again switch it off. So that way they would be able to at home only perform this paracentesis whenever the need would be based in. Another question is, are there possibilities for teleconsultation in case of need for palliative emergencies? Teleconsultation, you will be able to at least guide them what to do in, but if most of these patients here, you will require some of the other immediate intervention. So guiding over the phone and helping them liaison with the local, nearest local medical support would be better to do on a teleconsult rather than providing direct prescription. Yes, certain drugs like if you identify on a teleconsult, on a video consult, whether the patient has any spinal cord compression like features, or patient has minor bleeding from head and neck malignant wound, then over the phone you could prescribe certain medications, but this patient would be required to be seen by a physician in person also. So not it becomes a little riskier, because if in case it is not sometimes identifying it would be very difficult on a teleconsult. So I would suggest providing first aid management, but then have the patient being seen by a medical person. That could be even a nurse who is trained in palliative care would help you assess on the phone, and then you could provide a management guideline. Do we have time for another question, or do you want to move ahead?
Yeah. There is one more question. I don't know whether you have answered it or not. I lost my internet. So, 82-year-old with squamous cell carcinoma with fungating lesion over forehead on oral chemotherapy recently had bleeding from the lesion. Can we prescribe oral tranexamitas?
So do you want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Majority of the times, patients with ulcers like fungating wounds may not have a very good blood supply to the periphery with a malignant wound area. So systemic measures like oral tranexamic may not be so beneficial. If it's just a minor ooze associated with during dressing because the tissue is very friable, local ethamsalate would be a better choice to give in this particular patient, with especially with a malignant wound having a slow bleeding, which is like a very small ooze that is happening. So what we suggest is patients are already daily doing dressing with Metrogyl ointment. So we ask them to crush 2 or 3 tablets of ethamsalate, mix it with the Metrogyl ointment, make a form a paste and apply it as a paste over the sites where bleeding is. And that helps in local measures to control the bleeding.
Okay. Another question from Dr. Disney. Acute bowel obstruction in terminal malignancy. So I don't know whether how to manage or Dr.
In a,
Disney.
yes, sir, please tell me.
No, I want to ask the person what does he mean by that? How to manage or something else? Dr. Disney.
Sir, actually, I have a patient with CA stomach and I fear any day she'll go in for obstruction. So how can I help her? Is there something I can do from my side?
Okay.
That is my doubt.
Yeah. Dr. Kritika, you can answer.
Mainly preemptively, if you're thinking that the patient might go into a bowel obstruction, then preemptively
Yes.
it may not be really beneficial to, unless and you can explain to the family about oral intake, having adequate laxatives. So now the cause of bowel obstruction should also be coming in, whether it's because of a GI malignancy, are there any omental peritoneal nodules causing a small bowel or a large bowel obstruction? Is it related to a colorectal cancer causing an intrinsic mechanical bowel obstruction? So whether it's a functional, it's a mechanical, what kind of an obstruction it is depends on that. How would you try to manage it? Mainstay per se in a terminal malignancy also, if a patient presents with acute bowel obstruction, it would be trying to see whether you can correct it by conservative management. If a patient has a single level bowel obstruction, can also be referred for palliative surgeries like colostomy, ileostomy, because that will significantly improve the patient's functioning and symptom control. If the patient is feasible to undergo a surgery, like the patient is PS 2, 3, does not have much of a omental or peritoneal disease that would lead to prevention of us doing a surgery. So it's case based as to what is the primary malignancy, what is the disease burden, what is the performance status. If all of these are against it, then considering conservative management would be the best way to go in to treat acute bowel obstruction.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this question.
So anybody else? I think we can move on to patient story. So today's patient story will be presented by Dr. Abir. So Dr. Abir.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Abir. Basically, my specialty is actually emergency medicine. So that is why when we put on this list of case present, we chose this topic of palliative care emergencies But after selecting this topic, I should admit that I didn't come across any case which I could be presenting as of a palliative care emergency. Maybe I don't know. People are not coming to the hospital, to the emergency department with this, or maybe in the place where I work, there is an oncologist. That may be the reason. But then I put it up in our WhatsApp group that if somebody have a case, they can present, because I have already presented one case. But unfortunately, I think nobody got a case. So I have a case which just come to my memory a few years back. So I thought I'll be going to that case. Can have the next slide. So before I go to this proper case, I just tell you a little bit of background about this case. Actually, she is my neighbor. Actually, in the sense, my home is actually maybe around 15 to 20 minutes of walk from her home, and it's like a hilly area where I have to climb. It's like a trekking to 15 minutes of trekking to reach her home. And she was I put the age like 70, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know her exact age. And this diagnosis, even though I put a spinal cord compression and metastatic malignancy of breast, until she became paraplegic, I didn't know what condition she had. So this was actually when after she became paraplegic only, I could at least tell that it was metastatic malignancy. So she was like uh, she was the wife of actually my teacher. My teacher means the one who teaches the religious things, who teaches to read this Quran and all those things. So she knows me from a very small age, maybe of when I was 7, 8 years old. She used to come to my home almost every day, and along with her husband, and they used to teach me all those things. And she's a particular a very strictly religious, maybe I can tell. The every time she comes and she talks like there is nothing that you should be considered in this world. The all life starts after you die, and that was her entire concept in life. She was not bothered about anything happening here, even so such that whenever she come to my home, and when my home was getting renovated, she used to tell me, I'm afraid to enter your home, because now it's looks so good that I feel this is paradise, and I am worried that I may not get paradise in the next life if I do this. So she was that kind of a lady, and she used to walk all this 15-20 minutes of like a trekking almost every week to my home. And she was like that. And then once I started studying medicine and I finished it, she used to tell me or even my mom or even to her neighbors, like there are a few 3-4 home near to her house, and she used to tell them like, if at all I am going, like an advance directive, like a DNR. She was, if at all I'm going to become sick, or if I'm going to die and you want me to take to a doctor, don't take me to anyone except only Dr. Abir should come and see me. There, I should not go to hospital. If I'm dying, I want to die here. So that was her entire attitude of life. And so and I've never seen her sick until this. And maybe sometimes she used to come and ask me some tablets for some pains, aches, and something like that. Otherwise, apart from that, I never seen her with an illness. Okay, so that is the background of the case, and let me go to the case. Basically, she had no comorbidities, she had no illness. And the next slide. So so this case probably maybe in 2012-13, this is a story, it happened that time. The only complaint she had was a low back pain, which happened since 2 months. So every time, even then, she was walking to me. She was coming down and telling about the pain which is in the lower back, and no examination. Only she will tell you this pain, give me something. So I usually have some samples of pain medications. I used to give that, and some local application of ointment. And after some time, she tell, now I'm better. And next slide. So the history, it's like it started after history. I think it started 3 to 4 months back, which gradually become worse. And it was like 4 to 6 pain score, and she takes pain medications. And it was like then after maybe probably like okay, and then probably like 2 weeks, just like 2 weeks from then, she started to have pain radiating her lower limbs. She was not able. She feel tired, weak, and not able to do her routine jobs. Initially, she was working out. Like their home was very small. Maybe 2 rooms, 3 rooms, and even they had no restrooms inside. There was only one restroom outside, and she was a widow for maybe last 10 years or something, and she was staying alone. She had a daughter who got married, and they had their grandson who used to come and stay with her once in a while. And when she became this ill, she was not able to do. They were staying with her. They were helping her. So she's like, she was not able, then gradually she told she was not able to pass urine. But then she used to tell me, no, I'm not able to walk because of pain, so I have to pee in this bottle. That's why I'm not able to uh, pass urine. So give me something. But when I palpated, but I couldn't make out a proper bladder. So maybe I thought she was doing a little bit of maybe because she's lying down and things like that. And then one day, morning, I mean, just one day, then they called me up. She is unable to move, and when I went there, she was lying in, she was lying in a pool of urine and feces, everything there. Next slide. So when I went there, she was conscious oriented. She was not even moving, not moving any of her lower limbs. Upper limb was okay, and she was lying in a pool of urine and feces, which she passed suddenly. And she cannot impaired sense, and she cannot even recognize my proper touch on her lower limbs. There was no power on her lower limbs. Even I think there was flickering of movements. Apart from that, nothing. And impaired lower limb reflexes means maybe probably I didn't have anything to check. Maybe I had my Karski to check her plantar reflexes, and the Babinski was positive. I think so. That was my only thing which I remember about that. So basically, she had an acute, and then. And a few days that was the thing which when I could find on examination. And few days back when I went there for this pain, I gave her some steroids also. Maybe I was thinking, she is having this radiating pain, so sure, there was some this prolapse happening to her, and so I just put her on some steroids as well. Then a few days back, and just like 2-3 days after, this was how I could find her. Next slide. So then after that, when I saw her in this situation, even she was like, I don't want to go to hospital. You give me some medications. I lie here, I'll die. And I have to convince her, her daughter and her neighbors, everybody, just at least go to hospital. We can see if there is something we can do, and something like that. Then I have to talk to her for so much of time. And then I have to call for an ambulance because the road was also very small. A small ambulance could somehow come to that way. So, and I called my hospital and they sent an ambulance. We took her on it, but she was not very happy. But somehow when there, I talked with orthopedician, and he told that we'll do a CT. And CT probably I did for the spine. It was there was multiple vertebral fracture, and then the radials were let us see from where it comes from, and we did a chest and abdomen on the same table without bringing her out. And they could notice there was a mass in the breast, probably with a lung and liver metastasis, and also vertebral. But she was the only complaint she had was this pain in the back. Maybe she was not. I never complained about anything in the breast, and I didn't examine also. There was multiple vertebral fracture, and finally after this, there was no oncologist for us, and palliative care. But she told she doesn't want to do anything. She just want to go home, and she will lie like that. And she just put her on some analgesics, and with that, she was dispatched back to her home. Next slide. So the psychosocial aspects, she was widowed. As I told, there was background like she was widowed. She was staying alone, and yeah, even she was like, she don't even want to see any males. That was her concept. Even when she was sick, she don't want anybody to visit her. And as I was the only person allowed to treat her, and somehow I was able to take her to at least an hospital after a lot of after a lot of convincing her. And then, and after that, when she came back to the home, she was just next right. She was just put on analgesics, and I've given her methylprednisolone 4 milligram tablets. And it didn't take much long. Probably after this, after 10 days, she was in home, and her daughter and grandson, everybody was there. We put on a catheter. That's all we did from the hospital. And she was like, after 10 days, they called me up with she had some trouble in breathing. And then by the time I reached there, there was no respiration, and she died from the home, comfort of her home, basically. So her concern, she doesn't want, our concern was she doesn't need any treatment, and she was not worried about what's happening to her paralysis, whatever. She was not bothered. And there was basically nobody to help her except for this grandson who was supporting her. How they did was like, once in a week they will come, they'll bring her whatever, like rice, all those things. She cook herself, she eats, she lie down there, she won't go anywhere. And that's how she was continuing. Next. So it's a case of 70-year-old female with breast malignancy with multiple metastasis and spine metastasis leading to spine fracture and paraplegia. maybe we could talk about the psychosocial belief of staying away from any treatment. And the only thing I had was because when she had this pain, and I was thinking, I was never expecting a malignancy. I was thinking like an IVDP and spinal cord something. So I was put her steroids. I hope would steroids exacerbate a fracture? No. And at this stage, even if somebody comes at this stage in this with a multiple metastasis and malignancy, whether is there any treatment we should offer, or we can just leave them alone and just with pain management?
Thank you, Dr. Abir. So I request any one of you to comment on the questions that Abir has asked. How to deal with the belief, such beliefs? I am sure all of you might have seen patients like this. So what can be done in such situations?
She was a kind of lady, even if somebody comes to her home, she used to go behind the wall and then only will speak, or a curtain. She don't even talk, come to in front and talk. I mean, I don't know, maybe she knows me from very young age. I was able to see her treat her. Otherwise, it's that kind of belief was very difficult. Maybe they may be right in their beliefs.
Anybody? Dr. Bismi says counseling. Okay. Dr. Sudha. So, Dr. Pradika, have you seen patients like this with some beliefs, and how can we manage those situations?
I have not personally come across somebody like this with a strong belief of staying away from a doctor though. But per se, have we tried? We could, in this case, if the person has this fear of, doctors coming in and talking, did we try to some lay person, somebody from the team, not necessarily a doctor, say maybe a social worker or somebody like a social worker or a volunteer from the community, trying to help and go and talk to her and find out from her end whether someone who would have a more friendlier approach that she feels would go and try to talk to her and tell her what is exactly happening to her, and what the doctor here who's come to see her is trying to give her, like, comfort care, as one of them pointed out. Dr. Sudha madam has said, like, we're trying to give her comfort care. We're trying to provide relief from her distress right now and her suffering, and just trying to understand from her perspective. Maybe there was poor understanding as to what this person has come in to do. Could go back to her belief of not seeing a male, that strong notion of seeing a male person is like a sin in this life, and her afterlife that she had a belief in, that could be affected. Maybe that was a reason preventing her from approaching a doctor like this. Would most of the time a doctor approaching would be a male physician. So just a discussion, like, I don't know, this is not personally I have seen. Dr. Abir would be able to help us better.
Yeah, I think actually the problem was not a doctor; it was the problem of a male. Actually, she was concerned about a male person coming to her. Whether it is a doctor or even whatever social worker, that was her concern. I was able to talk to her because, she knows me from very young age, so I was able to talk to her and I was able to convince her, take to her at least to the hospital. But it was a little difficult from that point of view. Maybe in that time also I didn't had any palliative care training as well. So even I was thinking, no, there is nothing much I could do.
But this is something which is patient's belief, and we in palliative care would always go by what the patient's belief systems are there and work around that aspect and see what else can be done to make sure that she feels that comfort. Maybe a female attendant could go and try to build that trust with her, and then slowly tell her that these people are also here to help you. So she would have opened up. We don't know about it.
Yeah, maybe even at that point, even I was thinking, but let her be, let all this, maybe up to 70 years she lived in her belief. No, I don't want to change her it in a day or two. So I was also thinking, let that happen.
Yes.
Okay. We have to respect the patient wish, but I agree with the Kritika that we have to discuss with the patient. Actually, maybe it may be a religious belief or something else. Whether that can be influenced by somebody else, like some priest in that community, will be able to talk to her, and whether that belief can be changed, I am not sure. But that's a try that we can always do when somebody has such beliefs. Otherwise, if we can't come in terms with her view, then probably we have to do whatever possible for her. We have to respect her wish that she want to stay away from the meals. So, did steroids exacerbate her condition? Anybody? Anybody? What do you think about steroids? Whether that has exacerbated her condition? Yeah. Dr. Disney says no. Yeah. Kritika, I think you already mentioned about steroids in spinal cord compression, but you
Uh,
can speak.
Sir, as this was mainly a metastatic spinal cord compression, which we came to know later on based on her assessment. So, steroids would have actually helped her with relieving of the compressive features and the pain also per se. So, it wouldn't really exacerbate her condition. Worse, what would happen is if she would have had an underlying sepsis, like say a UTI or some other kind of infection, and when steroids are given without a cover of an appropriate antibiotic, then it would exacerbate an infection and worsen a condition. But directly, if this is not there, then steroids would have helped her with the symptom relief.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think I have not a comments on that. If she would have allowed for a treatment at this late stage, is there anything which I would have done or suggested? So I think Dr. Kritika, you can speak.
Sir, it's a question open for everyone. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, it's open for everybody. Yeah.
yeah, I would
Any
have.
participants? Anybody from participants?
Uh, I have one question. Like the steroid thing, the preferred one is dexamethasone, right? As you told in your presentation, Dr. Kritika, it's like dexamethasone will be the preferred one, right? When we
Yes,
in this,
yes.
yeah. It's like 16 milligrams per day.
Yeah, 16 milligrams is the initial dose that we advise in, and then 8 milligrams in two divided doses, or 12 milligrams per day. So 4 milligram in three doses, like that 8, 12, and 4 p.m. That we could be divided and initiated with when we are starting. And we are thinking if we're not able to give radiation, we're not able to do a surgery, then continuing the steroids for initial first 5 days and then tapering it off every 3 days and then stop. That is how we practice here, even in India. If any patient presents with a spinal cord compression. So, as
Yeah.
sir, you have mentioned, as in what if she would have allowed for treatment at this stage and all. So all it would go around whether is there anything reversible, whether the spinal cord compression could be treated with if it, since this was a very subacute acute presentation, so highly unlikely that we would be able to see some neurological improvement. But if the pain was very severe, then radiation therapy, so radiotherapy would have helped in relieving the pain per se. Then main would be looking at her comfort care. So a lot of nursing issues could be addressed at. So skin care explanation, or having some looking at hospice care for her, because even it was suggested that she's living alone, she's widowed, does not have any other caregiver with her. So some respite care or hospice care being offered, where somebody would be able to look after her since she's going to be bedbound, and there was bowel bladder incontinence. So someone will have to look after caring for those needs. So also trying to see whether if her daughter could be explained about her situation, trying to contact her daughter, trying to speak to her about it, if she would want to look after, or her suggestion is also going towards hospice care or respite care, then it could be offered through. I know certain areas may not have these services available, but there are a lot of community organizations that I know where a lot of volunteers are available to be able to help such patients. So then volunteer involvement, community involvement could be looked at it. But I would like suggest it in this way. I'm like, many others would have any suggestion if somebody could tell me.
In this case, actually, her daughter has come home, and she was staying with her for the rest of the days. And I think she died in another 10 days or less than 10 days. She died, but her
Okay.
daughter and her grandson was staying with her after all these things happened.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, something like pain management, looking at her nursing issues, her nutrition, cleaning and skin care and preventing bed sores, all. So the palliative care approach will be focused on these aspects rather than looking at treatment if it is not, we may not be able to undergo surgery for her, or if the time gap between onset of symptoms and for us to be able to diagnose it is a longer time, then radiation could only be just towards pain management, or if she's not even feasible for that, then it would be just symptom control. We would have
So,
gone by that way if we had a patient like this.
so in a case where if she had a severe pain, even at this stage, we can even consider radiotherapy as an approach for control her pain.
Along with our analgesics, yes, if at all our analgesics also are not really helping her, and she is not fit enough a candidate to be moved to a hospital where radiotherapy could be given, and neurologically if we don't see, then sometimes even giving radiotherapy may not be beneficial. But if analgesics are not controlling, then yes, even a single fraction of radiotherapy can help significantly.
She was not complaining much of pain. I don't know, maybe she was hiding it, or and one more question, like you were talking about the scoring system, like in fractures or something.
Yeah, the Mirel scoring, yes, yes. Most of the
So like
orthopedicians use it.
yeah, so we're talking about like less than 7 and 74. Like less than 7 means that means the patient does not need a surgery, or that means it does not have a risk for doing surgery. What do that actually mean?
This is mainly for the surgery need, whether the patient needs surgery for spinal stabilization.
Okay, so
Yes,
even less than 7 means she does not need a surgery.
yes, yes. Can be helped with managing with if it is a limbs that is there, so casts and radiotherapy would help in relieving of the disease burden and the symptoms also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. In this patient, she lived only 10 days after you diagnosed spinal cord compression, isn't it, Dr. Abhi?
Yeah. Not more than 10 days.
Okay. Yeah. So then in that case, probably radiotherapy was not the choice, because it will take some time to have a good effect for pain relief. Because of the radiation, there will be some edema of the food also. So we need to continue the steroids along with the radiotherapy. But I think what you uh, um, actually, I think the patient has chosen the right approach, because we did not want to go to hospital. I don't know what is the cause of death in this patient.
Yeah, maybe I don't know. Maybe some. I think it could be embolism, because what they told me was like she had trouble breathing and all those things. I don't know. Maybe an embolism. She was
Whether
lying,
it was something inside Dr. Pradeep.
or maybe she might have had an
We don't know what is it.
Yeah.
So that was the right decision, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it was good actually. I mean, at least now, I mean, she was happy, her family was happy, and maybe we don't know. She might have got the paradise as well.
That's our belief. Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. So shall we wind up this session?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr.